Again, good morning. It's good to be here with you. It's good to see everyone. And we welcome again our visitors that have come out to be with us this day. And by the way, we are recording the lessons. We're going to try to keep this updated. We're working on a couple of different things there. So if you desire a copy of this lesson, the only thing I need from you is if you send me an email or a text, and I'll have your information, and I can send you the link to this. This is on a YouTube account, so you can go there and pull it up. So just give me your cell number or your email address is all I need, and I can get that to you if you have a desire for the lesson. But again, it's good to be here this day, and it's a blessing to be able to have a new year that we can start off, and it's nothing better than being able to start off in God and with His work, with His worship. Those things are just, when you think about it, not to be morbid, but we'll start a year, but somewhere along the line there's going to be somebody who doesn't finish a year, right? One of these times it'll come to an end. So it's about what we put into these years. Our resolutions that we are making. Are we making spiritual resolutions so that we can move forward in the way that whether or not we see another year or not, we see God when it's all said and done, and that's the important thing. And so it's good to be able to do this spiritual work with you all here at King Street. When you think about nature and the world that we live in, there are things that God created and made from the very beginning. And of course we know the physical things that He put in motion and how He created things. And you think about the amazing things that He did make. You think about some of the animals that we see and how amazing they are. The beauty, the strength, the power, the size. Think about a big old elephant, right? Bull elephant. What an impressive creature. A blue whale, right? And then you can think about even something as simple as trees. And you go and you stand next to a giant redwood or sequoia, and you just sit there and you can drive a car through them, right? And it's amazing. And you just sit there and say, my God, how powerful of a God this is that made all these things. And even though all those things are in place, then you come along and you say, how in the world does all this stuff just continue to exist and function perfectly as God has designed it to do? Well, God used all of these laws that He put in place, laws that weren't things that were seen, but it was the mind that went behind them, and God spoke things into existence and said that they should operate and they should behave this way, and so it was. And oftentimes, probably the most simple one, because I don't, you ask me to name all the laws of nature, boy, I'm going to be about two of them and not be, like, I know it's there, but I don't know what to call it, right? But think about gravity. No one even thinks about getting out of bed, and when you swing your feet to the ground, you don't sit there and say, well, if I come out of bed too hard, I'm going to float up to the ceiling, right? You don't even think about it. We just pop out of bed and we start walking. If we have to jump over something, we know that we're going to come back down to the ground because gravity is there. The laws of nature are in place, and there's nothing that's going to change those laws. That no matter if we defy those laws, we realize that if I go and I jump off of the roof of my house, I'm going down, right? So I know that up front. So I may survive the fall this time, but if I keep jumping off the roof, eventually, that fall to the earth is going to always happen. Is going to sooner or later do me in. I could talk to you all day long about laws of nature, and you would understand that, and you would grasp it, and you would say, yeah, that makes sense. God is amazing that He did that. But what I want to talk to you about today are real laws and the spiritual laws that God has put in place. Now, I can just simply tell you to open up your New Testament and you'd have the most updated spiritual laws that there were. But what I would like to do today is talk about some of the ones that maybe we know they're there, but we don't think about them as often. Just like gravity, we know it's there, but we don't necessarily spend a lot of time, in the mornings waking up and saying, well, I wonder if gravity is going to hold today. The spiritual laws that God has put in place, there are many of them, and I won't cover all of them, obviously. I'll just touch bases on a few of those things. But They're the laws that govern how things are truly going to be. They're the real laws. They're more real than even gravity because these laws will determine our eternal destination. They determine the inner being, our souls, and how they relate to God. They determine the boundaries and the benefits of keeping those laws and respecting those laws, as well as the consequences of not doing them. Over in the book of Galatians, the Apostle Paul, writing to the churches of Galatia, and we're going to drop down to verse 7 to start there. He says, "Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. For he who sows to his flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. But he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life." That's a spiritual law. It's interesting how he says God is not mocked. That word means God's not deceived or God is not tricked. And so, so many people think that they can trick God. They think that, God's not going to see this over here that I'm doing. Or He's not going to remember this over here. Or if I come across this way and I say these religious words this way, well, God is, He's going to forget this bad thing over here that I'm maybe doing or thinking or participating in. But the law is, God's not going to be tricked. It's totally impossible. There's no way humanly possible to deceive or trick God. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that powerful, the mind of God that is there? I remember when a lot of times, but I haven't in a long, long time, but you remember sometime you go get some change from someone and they would give you one of them Canadian quarters. And you're sitting there with that Canadian quarter and it's like, man, they slipped that one right by me. And sometimes I would go and I would say, well, this vending machine, it won't know the difference in this, right? Boop, it drops to the bottom, right? Could not trick that vending machine into taking that Canadian quarter, no matter what, no matter how many times, because it was just not going to be tricked that way, you see. God is not mocked, and it's very important for us to understand that. You got to deal honestly with God. In our hearts and in our thoughts, and as God will relate to us, He knows those things that are there. And it's kind of foolish for a human being to think that God doesn't understand and doesn't know everything that's going on within us and understands it very clearly. Sometimes people will tell you when they're doing something wrong, they'll say, hey, God understands. And the problem is God does understand, right? He does. He understands every detail of it. He knows why I did it. He knows the motive behind it. He knows the intentions that are there. He knows the good intentions. Even when things don't necessarily turn out right, He knows the heart of a difference. He knows the difference of the heart of someone like David versus someone like Ahab, you see. They may have both done something wrong, but the heart of David would be different than the heart of Ahab. He goes on in this verse and also continues to tell us things that are definitely as true as gravity would be to us when he goes on and he says that whatsoever a man sows, this he will also reap. Isn't that interesting? It doesn't matter what I plant, because what I plant is what I'm going to reap, you see. So in a sense it matters, obviously. But what I'm saying is that what I put in motion, that's what I'm going to receive on the other side of that thing. You see, it's not going to change any. Too often spiritually, people will actually think that they can plant carnal things, and then somewhere along the line it's going to poof and change, and it's going to be some spiritual benefit behind it, and it never will ever be that way. It's a spiritual law. It won't ever change. If I plant to the flesh, if I sow those things in the flesh that are appealing to the flesh, the carnal, the here and now, those things that are the sinful side of life, then guess what? It's not going to turn into something spiritual down the road. It never will. I know sometimes I've tried to deceive myself, not deceive God, but deceive myself into thinking that, something that was bad, don't necessarily have to worry about dealing with it because, guess what? Eventually down the road it'll turn to something good. It will never happen. It never has happened, and it never will happen. It will always go the wrong direction, you see. So it's kind of foolish with people if we plant carnal things and then turn around and look and expect for those spiritual things. Spiritual things are a pursuit that we plant. We have to make an effort to do those things that are spiritual and right before God. We have to have a determination to those things. This time of year, a lot of people have New Year's resolutions, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a good thing. Because we put our foot in the ground and we say, this year I've got a new start, I've got a new calendar in front of me, and so therefore I'm planting my foot in the ground and I'm going to do and pursue those things that are right. Maybe I have an attitude problem that I know of. Maybe I have an anger issue that maybe every time I get out here in the traffic and I'm dealing with all these crazy people out here cutting me off and blowing their horns at me and all these things, and I know that within me that I have an anger issue, then I put my foot in the ground and say, I'm going to now begin to plant spiritual things there, because guess what? If I don't do anything about my anger issue, it's not going to just turn good one day, you see. It's going to just blow up and become worse, you see. The sun will eventually go down on my wrath, you see. And it'll lead me into something the wrong way. But if I decide within myself, you see, that now I'm going to replace that. So instead of me turning to that, I'm going to turn to prayer. Instead of me yelling and screaming back at them, I'm going to just pray for them. Because God tells me to do that. And I begin to plant those things. Isn't it amazing how we can change our disposition and our behavior and our attitude and what we are? Isn't it amazing how the gospel can change that? Well, how does that happen? Because we plant spiritual things and they grow. How did Saul become Paul, right? Because he planted. He washed away his sins and he began to plant. Immediately he began to plant those spiritual things and then think about what God was able to do with it. Over in Romans, the 6th chapter, in verse 23, the Bible there says that the wages of sin is death. That's the first part of that passage, at least. The wages of sin are death. In James, the first chapter, and I'll turn over there real quick, and we'll read verses 13 to 14. He says, let no one says when he is tempted, I'm tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he's drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Even though that's a passage we've heard many times before, and it's easy to kind of overlook it, it's a spiritual law. The wages of sin being death, there will never be a time when sin will not lead to spiritual death. It just will never be a situation where I can participate in sin and that sin not eventually goes through its processes and brings about that spiritual separation and that death. Because if we're separated from God, we are dead. Just as the brethren over in Ephesians were told about that they were once dead in their trespasses and sin. Sin will always cause death because that's a spiritual law. That's not going to change. No matter how long I live, no matter how sophisticated our lives get here in our world and our society gets, it will never change. It will always be that principle that God has taught will always be there. Sin will always cause death. And think about it. It's nothing more precious to us, especially once we start getting into that grandparent age, isn't it? We start looking at our children. Parents, they got so much to deal with children, right? They don't necessarily get to enjoy everything about their children. Once you get to be a grandparent, you get to sit back and enjoy a little bit more because the parents are dealing with all the problems, right? But when you look at those little faces and you realize that if life continues on, and as sad as it is, one day they're going to make those decisions and they're going to come to that age of accountability and they're going to make the decision and they're going to sin against God. And that innocence that once was there is going to be taken away. The innocence, they're going to lose their innocence. Just like Adam and Eve. They were that innocent state with God. And sin came in and it killed the innocence. It was there because sin causes death. And it does that with all of us and anyone who participates in it. And it brings about that separation that is there. That death will always put us in that position where we're, instead of being in that union and that happiness state with God, think about how wonderful it was in the beginning with Adam and he's there and he's in the garden with God and they're communing together. And then, comes that sad day where God's looking for him and he tells him, where are you, Adam? And, I hid from you because I was afraid. Because sin is going to do that. It's a spiritual law. It has to cause us to think within ourselves that we can't, just basically look at sin and say, well, hey, we're going to all sin. We're all going to fall short and all that. That's true. But we have to wage war against sin because it's the death and the damage that it causes. It messes up our families, doesn't it? It ruins relationships. It makes things bad on the job, doesn't it? Think about how good your job would be if sin wasn't there. It destroys our communities. You think about there are certain parts and certain places you wouldn't want to be caught in after dark. Why is that? Because sin and that death that is caused by it. You see the consequences of that. The dangers that are all around us that we face. The depression and all of the sadness and the misery of human existence is because sin has come along. We wonder about, what's going to be the fate of our country? You know what? It don't matter what kind of political party's in place. The sin that affects our country by individuals participating in it is how God is going to judge the nation, you see. Those things will affect us and they destroy us because that sin will always bring forth death. Sin will never produce something good, you see. It never will. It's a spiritual law. We can't get by it. Over in Hebrews 11 in verse 6, the passage you know real well, we quote it many times. He says there that without faith it's impossible to please God. But he that comes to God must believe that he is, and he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. So many people, they kind of think that basically that God has to earn their faith. And if God messes up, and let the wrong person die, they're not going to give God their faith. They're going to hold it over and make him earn that faith some kind of way. We've got that all backwards, you see. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. You see, so faith is something we generate and we offer to God, and we hope that he will accept that, you see, because this doesn't work the other way, because the spiritual law says that without it, literally the creator of the world, you cannot please him. Literally the one who is the giver of all good blessings, you cannot please him. The one who has the keys to our eternal salvation, it's impossible to even get his attention without faith. It's a spiritual law. It tells us what we should be working on in our lives. We have to grow our faith. We have to become stronger in our faith. We have to make sure that that is the dominant thing. Isn't that amazing? Here's this God that is so powerful and could demand anything of us. And what he says is that from your heart, you will have to believe that I am he with all of your heart. Remember, as the eunuch is going along and with Philip, and he wants to be baptized, and Philip tells him, you can. But you got to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. He says with all your heart. You got to believe that, you see. It has to be the dominant thing that is there, because without it, it's not just something, because we think of faith as like this, it's this abstract thing. I got to have real things that I can touch and feel. But faith is an abstract thing, so if I don't really get that down, it's no big deal. But I got to take care of these things that I can touch and feel. We're so wrong with that. It's spiritual law. It is a gatekeeper that is a massive gatekeeper. No one can fake faith with God. He's going to hold us accountable for that. We have to believe that he truly is who he is, who he claims to be, and all that he says. That's a part of that. In Mark 12, Jesus was asked a question or addressing a question about the greatest commandment. And in verse 30, he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. Isn't that amazing? Is there some part of a human being's existence that's left out in that passage? Loving God to that degree. You know, sometimes we can say we love anything. You know, I love my football team when they're winning, right? You know, I love my cat. I love my TV. And we use that word, and then we kind of neutralize it down to not meaning a whole lot when it comes down to important things. And so Jesus comes along here in this passage, and he really establishes it. And maybe he says this is the greatest of the laws that you can have. There is no greater law than this one thing. And think about it sometime us as human beings. You know, our love is something special to us. You know, who we love and what we love is our choice, and we're gonna hold to that. And Jesus is coming along here and saying, just like gravity, if you jump off that roof, you're going down. Just like gravity, you're going to have to, even more so, you're going to have to love the God that created you more than your own self, more than any other thing that you participate in or you're part of, more than any other relationship. And you're going to have to love him more than yourself to such a degree that you are willing to love him with all, he says. He uses that word all, and that's pretty powerful. He doesn't leave anything out. He says the love for God has got to be just fully consuming of us. How are we doing with that? It's a spiritual law. We can't be successful spiritually, you see, unless we have this law locked up. And we, just like, you know, I'm not going to be very successful if every morning I climb up to the top of my roof and jump off, okay? You know, I may be good for a little bit, and the older I get, sooner or later, bones are going to start getting broken, right? If you don't take me to the nut house first, right? Because I'm defying this law. Everybody's going to say, does he not understand gravity, how it works? We need to get some help for Larry, because Larry has lost it. Larry has really lost it when he approaches life, and he does not realize, and he's not consumed and absorbed by the concept of having to love the God of heaven with all of his heart. Every bit of his heart, every bit of his mind, every bit of his soul, and with every bit of his strength. Isn't that all consuming? Isn't that pretty impressive, right? How are we doing with that? Do we some of these laws, just like gravity, I don't think about it, right? Until something happens. Do we think about this? Jesus said, this is the most important commandment there is. Do you think God is that lovable? You know, over in the book of Revelations, the church at Ephesus, they had all those wonderful things going on with them, and the Lord called them on the carpet in a very strong way. And he told them, hey, I'm going to remove the candlestick from you. My very presence, I'm going to remove it from you. You know why? Because you have left your first love. A first love is real special. It is the idea that not do I have to be with this person, I want to be with them. Not that I have to call them up and talk to them on the phone. Once I get to talking to them on the phone, I don't want to hang up. Jesus is saying we need to adore our God. Do we think he is worthy of that? Is he worthy of that kind of adoration? To the point when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I'm thinking about is the love of my life in him, my Father. Because he's literally inundated me and overwhelmed me with all of that goodness and those blessings and that kindness and the mercy. That's how God approaches us. The forgiveness that is there. Can you imagine someone who you harm, you do things against, and they're willing to accept you back? No limitations to that. I'll take you back. When everybody else would just kick us to the side, if we sinned against any, think about it, every sin that we commit is against God. Every sin that we commit is against God. I don't care if we, didn't pay our taxes. I don't care if we threw a rock at the neighbor's cat. Our sins are always against God, every last one of them. Now, we sin against other people from time to time, and we may do something. We may not speak to them. We may say the wrong thing at the wrong time, and that's it. And you know how sometimes hard it is to get them to even look at you again, right? Have you ever had somebody who'll tell you, I can't ever forgive you for that? And you're kind of like, well, what did I do, right?